welcome. My name is Helena Gindi. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator for the Posen Foundation. Tonight's event, Is Jewish Education Broken?, is presented by Speakers Lab and the Posen Foundation, and co-sponsored by the New School, Tablet Magazine, and the 14th Street Y. This is the second event presented by Speakers Lab, a new public programming initiative of the Posen Foundation about Jewish culture and identity. The Posen Foundation supports Jewish learning in universities, middle and high schools, awards fellowships to emerging scholars and fiction writers, and supports public programming. Just this November, the Posen Foundation celebrated the release of the first volume of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, a 10-volume anthology of 3,000 years of Jewish cultural works. To learn more about the anthology and our foundation's work, please visit our website, posenfoundation.org. All of this brings me to tonight's event. Tonight, our panelists and you here in our audience will discuss the state and future of liberal Jewish education in America. Is liberal Jewish education genuinely relevant to today's students? Does it resonate with 21st century Jewish life? Or is it time for new visions and new models? We will begin the conversation with our panelists and then open the conversation up to all of you here. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage. Please. So to my left, Jonathan Krasner, Associate Professor of the American Jewish Experience at Hebrew Union College. Tali Zelkowitz, Assistant Professor of Education at Hebrew Union College. Tzvi Beckerman, Director of Melton Center for Jewish Education at Hebrew University. And Benjamin Jacobs, Assistant Professor of Social Studies, Education, and Jewish Studies at NYU. And moderating tonight, Jonathan Wucher, who has graciously stepped in to replace Bethany Horowitz, who unfortunately could not be here tonight. Jonathan Wucher, the Chief Ideas Officer at JESNA, the Jewish Education Service of North America. Without further ado, thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to the Posen Foundation and the other co-sponsors for organizing this evening. We are down here, the lights are shining on us. We have no idea who you are up there, but we trust that you are people who are here because you're interested in the future of Jewish education. And we have a great panel here. I'd like to pretend that this is a group that is brought together for the first time for this event. But in fact, many of us know one another, and it's a real privilege for me. I'm sorry that Bethany wasn't feeling well and was not able to be here, but it's a privilege for me to be able to moderate a discussion among these colleagues. I want to say at the outset that there's some terminology that we may be exploring further in the course of the evening, like the notion of liberal Jewish education. I feel like a little bit like Potter Stewart in his famous comments about pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And I'm not going to try to define liberal Jewish education, but hopefully some ideas about it will emerge out of the conversation. I am not a very experienced moderator, so I hope you'll be generous, and I hope the panelists will be generous with me. But I was thinking that the opportunity to do this was good because it could be a tryout for 2016, and maybe if this goes well tonight, I'll get to do one of those presidential debates. Having said that, I want to plunge right into the meat of the evening. So let me start with a very simple question. Is Jewish education broken? And if so, what's broken about it? Jonathan, you want to kick us off?
I don't think Jewish education is broken. I think that there are certain built-in problems that liberal Jewish education has faced since the large-scale immigration to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century, and that is that at least on a formal level, Jewish education has been synonymous with supplementary education or perhaps complementary education, or whatever the term that, the euphemism that you want to use. But as long as education is happening in a supplementary environment, as long as it's something that happens after school, after your real school in quotation marks, there are going to be built-in limitations to it. Of course, education is much larger than the formal afternoon school or Sunday school. But if that's your basic building block, then I think that the problem is structural. The problem is a systems problem. It's not necessarily an ideas problem or a pedagogical problem. I think there are certain limitations that are built into the reality. And if you're going to choose that reality and you're not going to go to day school, then that's what you got.
I think Mark Twain is helpful here. My favorite quote of his that I try to live by, and I try to ask my students to remember it as well: never let your schooling interfere with your education. And I think that the case of is Jewish education broken is a case of the schooling being broken to some extent, more than others in certain settings. But the Jewish education being broken, I think it's has tremendous treasure trove of things to offer. It's the way that we're trying to present it, formally and informally, that I think is broken. But I add one last caveat to say, all of this assumes that we have some sense of what Jewish education would look like fixed. So, what's the vision? And I think brokenness is in the eye of the beholder. It's a Rorschach for everyone's different philosophies of what counts as authentic, legitimate, and ultimately generative Jewish education.
I've been married for 40 years, and Rivka says I'm wrong. She's been saying that for 40 years, so she might be right. I think she's right, so please keep that in mind in my response. I'm tremendously thankful for Elena Gindi. She's been so kind, and she's engaged me in a dialogue through email mostly, and I've enjoyed it tremendously, and that's the reason why I'm here. Now, something specific about the question, I think the question is the wrong question. Questions have to be, in general, we have to be very careful with language. Is Jewish education broken is a bad question. The question is, who is asking the question? Okay, about whom are we asking the question? I think we're asking the questions about liberal education. Liberal education I define as that education, religious or secular, which tries to have a rhetoric about Jewish education, which basically means getting our children to Harvard, and they are very successful at that. And I think they should keep doing that as much as they want, because I believe that communities should decide by themselves what good education is all about. And if Jewish education is about getting into Harvard, they should keep doing it. Enough.
You think I would have thought of what I was going to say after 3 other people already told me? No, the question, I would agree that the question is difficult to answer, probably because of the terminology used or how general it might be. But even leaving that aside, I do think that even though I can be very optimistic about several of the ongoing, long-standing programs in the Jewish education world that have been quite successful, and I can be very pessimistic about some of the long-time ongoing programs in Jewish education that have not been successful. I think for me, one of the things that concerns me about Jewish education contemporarily is a concern that is as long time as the successful and less successful programs. So I think about, you quoted Mark Twain, so I think about a line that I always use from Irving Howe when writing World of Our Fathers. when he was talking about supplementary Jewish schooling in the early part of the 20th century, he talked about how Jewish immigrant boys came to resent the Talmud Torah as a theft of time that could be better used playing stickball. And Barry Chazan, more recently in the International Handbook of Jewish Education, in his article there, really captured almost the same sentiment when he talked about how among rank-and-file Jewish kids, Jewish education is not an entity like we think of it, as something that would be successful or not, but it's Jewish education means boring. Jewish education means something my parents made me do. Jewish education means when's my bar mitzvah already? Or best, he wrote that it comes across as a grunt, sigh, and whine. And I think that's what concerns me about it, but I don't think it's necessarily a new concern. It's just that we keep on trying to address, what to do with it.
So if it's a bad question, and Jewish education isn't necessarily broken, but it is boring for many people, then what should our goals be? I mean, does Jewish education have goals? Does it need goals? What should those goals be? Because maybe you're right that you can't say something's broken unless you decide what it ought to be. And we don't have to go in any particular order now. It's a free-for-all from here on in. Just fight for the mic, Zvi doesn't like that. Too well behaved.
I come from a country that only fights, which is not good for the Jews. Of course, not for the Palestinians either. So we should not fight.
I think it should be about meaning making, for starters. I know that that's become something of a cliche in the last few years, but usually cliches do have a basis in fact, or at least there's something behind them. I think we're at a point where our identities, to the extent that we can talk about that, are freely chosen. We don't live in a society that puts us in a box and tells us that we have to do this, that, and the other thing, nor do we have to have a single identity. We're constantly putting on new identities, new faces based on the situation, based on how we feel, based on what day it is. So in that respect, Jewish education, in order for it to be worth something to the people involved, and that includes not only the learners, but also the community that sponsors it, it has to prove itself by giving people something. I mean, Zvi was perhaps being a little tongue-in-cheek, maybe not, by saying that if the goal is Harvard, then we've been remarkably successful. Well, define what the goal is. I think the goal for many people beyond Harvard is that, to the extent that I want to remain Jewish, to the extent that Jewish is one of those lenses that I put up when I see the world, that it should do something for me. It should make me feel good. It should make me feel like I'm connected to something larger than myself. You fill in the blank, but whatever it is, it should be meaningful to me.
Is that what you mean by meaning making? That it should fill in some sort of...
that it should be meaningful.
And is it?
No. I think...
So something's broken.
The beauty of the question, what is the vision for what fixed Jewish education looks like, is that it immediately hurls us all into what I call the politics of authenticity. We're immediately hurled into a set of templates or recipes or lists of ingredients that count versus others that don't count or count less. And so I actually would answer the question not in terms of content. I'm less invested in specific canons of content that count more or less for what is a generative Jewish education, and more interested in quality problems. And I think what we're doing right now is too often kissing through a sheet, let's say. We have liberal Jews who are many times mediated from original sources, and we have lots of good reasons to explain. Well, they don't have the Hebrew, they don't have the skills, they don't have the background, they don't have, but I think of the work going on right now in pedagogical scholarly fields on authentic assessment. And the more I read about authentic assessment and the more I hear the Avichai Foundation, for example, hiring folks from the Jewish Education Project and folks from experiments in congregational education to narrow the major gap, namely, what did they find? Lo and behold, primarily religious schools, congregational schools, aren't assessing. Never mind authentic assessment. They're not assessing at all. And that means that no learners, or very few learners, are actually able to receive any kind of feedback on the growth. There's no sense of achievement. There's no sense of getting involved in a quality problem or task and developing some sense of mastery and independence and appreciation for getting close enough to the content to love it or hate it. So it's, of course, it's experienced as superficial and parve because there is this multiply mediated process that makes me sad, and I think it's unnecessary.
See, you look pained, but you've written also, I think, about the problem of people getting things through filters and not being given the opportunity to grapple with the direct material.
I respect my enemies tremendously. I do think that Jewish liberal education is achieving what it wants. It's guided by people that have made millions, and people that have made millions are not idiots. That's the most important thing always to remember. They dominate us. Who's speaking here are academics. I am very limited. Any foundation other than the Posen Foundation that at least we know where they stand ideologically, all the rest hide that. It's embarrassing. And they dominate the world of Jewish education, and we participate in that domination, and that's embarrassing, and that's a big problem. Gershon Cohen, over 60, 70 years ago, spoke about the tremendous importance of assimilation. Jewish education today cannot understand assimilation as something positive. That's embarrassing. There is something tremendously Catholic about Jewish education today. They speak about faith. They speak about idealism and values in an idealist way. For whoever checks the development of Judaism throughout history realizes that it has little to do with what the Jewish sources are all about. And those are the things that worry me. I forgot what else to say. I write down things, but things run so fast that I get confused. So that's it for now.
Can I just say, though, before we write a eulogy for Jewish education, as you were saying, very quickly, Tali, yes, it's broken. So I'm thinking of a couple of examples of Jewish education. My daughter went to a sleepaway camp this summer called Eden Village Camp, which is up in Putnam Valley. It's an eco-farming camp. She came home very enthusiastic, full of love for the soil and the connection between Judaism and the soil. That was successful education. My son belongs to PJ Library. We get these books every month in the mail. Some are better, some are worse, but he enjoys them, and he is developing a love of Judaism through those books. That's a success, so it's checkered out there, I would say.
So, to quote a favorite quote of mine, which I believe if Daniel Petter-Lipstein is out there somewhere, he has paraphrased, the future of Jewish education is already here. William Gibson said, the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. What I hear you all saying is the future of Jewish education is here, but not for everyone. And it seems to me that in and of itself is a problem and a challenge for us. And one of the reasons that some people have postulated, and I think it's also postulated in some of the publicity material for this evening, is because we're living in a very different world than Jews lived in. Certainly, Jonathan, in the period that you wrote about, the formative period of American Jewish education in the early and middle decades of the 20th century, but I would argue perhaps even a very different world than we lived in 30 years ago. Doesn't that mean that the Jewish education that we're doing today, which is not Eden Village, which is not PJ bringing stuff into the home, but what most young Jews experience, as you were saying, Tali, I think, in our supplementary schools, et cetera, is a little outdated and responding to a world that no longer exists?
I'd love to jump on that. I think, and I wrote this in my, I know everyone read the speaker's
Yes,
statement.
you all read their pieces, right?
Yeah. But that, excuse me, that I think we can all point to a whole litany of tremendously exciting new initiatives that have been going on in the last decade or so. I would claim that it's certainly, I think, in the aggregate, the most creative period in the American Jewish education enterprise since its founding about 100 years ago. But I also still think about the numbers, the large majority, like you said, John, who are still in a system that is still very systematic and not in these anecdotal, maybe they're getting PJ Library, maybe they're not, maybe they're in PJ Library and they get the books, but they're not engaging in them or whatever it might be, or these summer camps that exist are great. I think of, for example, B'chol Hashon, which is another one which brings Jews from a variety of backgrounds together. They make for great stories, but they're not a new system. And I'm starting to think that we need to think much more systematically, not necessarily a birthright Israel sort of way either, which is a new system that was laid on to what we have, but more systematically about what alternatives to what we just accept as what Jewish education looks like might be. For example, getting away from the supplementary school system tied to synagogues and back to the Talmud Torah system tied to communities. That Jonathan can tell you all about why they failed. But when they weren't failing, there was an idea there that might hold water for certain communities today. That's not denominationally based. That's not necessarily tied to synagogue dues. That might be, I don't know. So I'll leave it there.
I realized I needed to clarify an assumption that I make. When I say Jewish education is broken, I'm kind of thrilled about it because I think that it's an opportunity. And if you ask me, what does a fixed Jewish educational world look like? For me, the primary piece would be that we would wholeheartedly embrace, not just face, but embrace dissonance. John Sarna, the historian, has said that the program, the project of liberal Jews, maybe all Jews, but liberal Jews in America after emancipation and since, has been to figure out how to be a part of and simultaneously apart from, John studied with him, American society as Jews. And I'm not the historian on this panel, but I keep quoting historians. We're not the first generation to want our latkes and eat it too. In the golden age of Spain, you guys will correct me if I'm wrong, we had sort of functional ancestors that wanted to write romantic poetry, love poetry in Arabic and Spanish, and they wanted Hebrew. They wanted liturgy and piyutim, and they wanted science and art. And we're not the first people to try and figure out how to stitch this thing together and live in both worlds. So I think what we need to stop being allergic to is the dissonance and use it rather than be allergic to it.
So does that mean that we should be much more explicit in embracing, for example, the multicultural ideologies that have begun to penetrate into educational thinking generally, that basically say there is no dominant culture that we should be entering into? We all today have the freedom to move among multiple cultures, and we can bring our culture and mix it with others. Are we moving towards a period when this kind of Jews apart and apart, a part and apart, really is passé because the nature of society and culture has changed dramatically, and we need to recreate a Jewish education that's appropriate for a world in which people will be much more mobile culturally, mobile psychologically. Does that make sense?
I would say, I think that, and you're hitting on a great note here about what the end result was in terms of, what did it mean to be Americanized 100 years ago? That meant, in part, what Zvi's been talking about, in part, what Jonathan's been talking about, a melding into a perception of a monolithic, white, Anglo-Saxon, middle class, perhaps, upwardly mobile, you can fill in more things like that, society. And Jews were very successful at capitalizing on a system that would enable them to do that by taking advantage of public schooling by day and then maintaining a Jewish education in one way or another by night. But I think you're right that notion of what it means to be, I only use, I don't mean to be such the academic professor up here, but it's hard not to, in the modern, in the postmodern, let's say, even era, refer to American without putting it in, quotes, so to speak. What is an American? We haven't decided what an American is. There's multicultural, there's, we have a big world that we live in. And I think that what you're talking about is that the challenge is now to see how you meld into a multicultural, very multivalent, dynamic society that might even be global, cosmopolitan, well beyond sort of the nation state that we envisioned before. And that's a moving target in some respects, but it also has the potential to make things a lot more exciting than to just say, I talk about this in something else I've written, the old question, are you a Jewish American or an American Jew, that we all grew up with in day school or Hebrew school or whatever.
In Four Corners exercises, right?
English is like your, eighth language or something? But that we did, we definitely did. It just has no resonance among kids today. What do you mean? Which one is first? It just doesn't work.
I think people still do live their lives through a narrative. People need a story that they tell about themselves. It can be a contradictory story. It can be a story that changes over time. But I think people would like to believe, regardless of whether it's true or not, that there's some consistency, that we're not just snapshots, moment by moment by moment. And then to that extent, I think that Judaism's, and I put the S at the end over there, provide some kind of grounding. And I think people are just naturally are looking for that grounding. They may be fooling themselves. We could talk about that. And it's not all they're not all gonna reach for the same thing. As we were talking before, I was thinking a little bit about this idea that has been percolating about the notion of concierge Judaism, right? This idea that we're all going to have, our gym instructor, whatever, our our gym instructor, advisor, person who's going to sit with us and who's going to plan, 20 push-ups and, which machines we're going to use, and, that's going to be the way in which we're going to approach Judaism. So there's going to be a whole smorgasbord out there, and we're going to choose, something from this table and something from that table. Of course, there have to be tables with with dishes on them. Someone's got to make the dishes. And I think that's what Ben was getting at before when he was talking a little bit about moving away from a synagogue structure. You can say a lot of things about the synagogue and the deficiencies of synagogue education, but the synagogue provided an infrastructure for education. So if we're going to move away from that, we need to find something to take the place of the synagogue, or things to take the place of the synagogue, because the truth is, education can only be limited in Starbucks.
So let me press that point a little bit, because I think you're framing something that might lead us in a perhaps impolitic direction, picking up on Ben's comment as well. I might make the argument that the problem is that we've been offering only one narrative in Jewish education, a religious narrative. And that's not a narrative that is sufficient. In other words, our table is too small. It offers too few dishes. And that what we really need in Jewish education today is to open things up so that we can have access to much more than just that one table. Structurally, that might mean separating more of Jewish education from the religious auspices under which it tends to be offered in America. But ideologically, it might mean opening up Jewish education to a much greater variety of standpoints as to what Jewish life is, how it ought to be lived. In fact, maybe it means turning the asylum over to the inmates and saying, you all now need to figure out what it is.
I think it's unhelpful to constantly pit culture against religion. I kind of reject the dichotomy, because culture is seen as sort of the enemy, I think, by the organized Jewish world, by people who are trying to build Jewish identities. Culture is the pale version of what we're really trying to do. It's as if. But I really think that, again, I'll try not to be the academic here too, but sociologically speaking, religion is a kind of culture among many other types of expressions. And I would love to see a paradigm shift where we started saying, hey, you know what? Culture is what Jerome Bruner said it was. It provides three things. One, it provides the norms and the rules for a group of people calling what they call possible and what they call ordinary, and it provides the means for relating to what is possible and ordinary. And that definition of culture, to me, explains all sorts of religious cultures, regardless of where you put your halachic boundaries. So for me, the question of multiculturalism is really about boundary navigation. And what sends people, it seems, into apoplectics is fluidity. That's uncomfortable. But for me, and maybe this is one thing all four of us have in common, the messiness, and finally acknowledging and accounting for the messiness that is Jewish identity formation and Judaism's, is tremendously aligned with reality. And it's perhaps neurotic to try to plug our ears and say, la, 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 la. That's not how identity formation works, Jewish or otherwise.
So what does this look like? You're all academics. I've been accused of continuing to behave like an academic, even though I've been out of the academy for quite a few years. It's easy, to talk on this kind of conceptual, theoretical level. Take that down to a more practical level. What does that actually mean? Ben gave us one possibility. Let's move Jewish education out of predominantly religious institutions and put it back in a more communal framework. But what does it mean for curriculum? What does it mean for
payment of the way we pay teachers, maybe you want to mean?
Whatever.
Instead of curriculum? Because
Whatever.
The issue is not curriculum. The issue is how much money we're ready to pay for our teachers. how serious we're about that. There's a very ideological point about framing things about issues of curriculum and not issues of structure and payment. Anybody here is a teacher? In the public, I mean. No teachers in the public? My God, useless. There is a hand. Any teachers? Yeah. Are you well paid? Yeah. You're well paid. Well paid relative to what?
Other religious schools I taught at.
Bad comparison. Yes, but I think that it's so easy to speak about Jewish education as if the issue would be Jewish, that it's ridiculous.
Well, it's a real, actually, this problem of paying teachers, I mean, I agree with you. It's a real problem, especially in a society.
But even people like us are so ready to speak about as if the problem were Judaic values or Judaic issues, when the problems are social, political issues that none of us speaks about, and the foundations that support the stupid research that is being done in Jewish education, okay, and dominate it.
Tell us what
and
you really
call
think.
that academic, which is totally ridiculous. Okay, we don't speak about that. We are all ready to be also critical, and then keep speaking about this irrelevant issues. My God.
Well, can I ask Sophia a question? Yeah. What counts as real research for you?
Real research, we basically know what it is. It's paid by uninterested parties. The one thing that the Jewish world has not been able to ever do. And us as researchers, we pay the price of being supported by institutions that have ideologies different from the Posen Foundation, which are not declared.
Okay, well, I was just going to say very quickly, I think that to the extent that we are living in a society that has a problem paying for content, whether it's a song that we download, or whether it's news that we get from any kind of source, I think we're in a lot of trouble if you apply that to the way that we think about education. Are we willing to pay for quality education?
Do we need to be paying for quality education today in the same way that it's been done?
It depends if the Jews believe that they have to continue being isolated from the world so as to not to be identified as Jews and allowed to succeed within Harvard, or if they are ready to join the world and the struggles for justice, which liberal Judaism has never been ready to do.
I'm hearing two different things here. I want to try to separate these two.
Only two?
Don't separate. The world is complex. Keep it complex.
No.
If you make it easy, we get the education
I'm the guy who wrote
we
about
have
complex
today.
systems theory as a metaphor for understanding American Jewish life. No, I want to keep two things separate, though, because I think there are two separate strands here. What I hear you talking about, Jonathan, is that if we really want to have quality Jewish education, whatever the heck that means, we have to be prepared to make the investments that are appropriate for that, whether that means paying teachers more or whatever. But I read Seth Godin, and Seth Godin says we're moving into a period in human history when, thanks to technology, thanks to the internet, the old models of education are sort of barely hanging on at high prestige places like Harvard and Yale that can charge $60,000 a year. But except for those, the pressure is all in the opposite direction, because knowledge is now so ubiquitous, it's so easily accessible, that in fact we have to get used to a world in which learning is a process that's available to everyone and almost essentially free. So I'm wondering, is the problem in Jewish education that we don't invest enough, or is the problem that we haven't done enough to bring Jewish education into this era where it really can be free and open to everyone? Zvi, I think, wants to respond. We'll get to your issue in a minute. We'll get back to
No,
the...
I just wanted to remind us all that most Jews throughout history knew nothing about Judaism and were Jews. The whole idea that Judaism has to do with knowledge is totally irrelevant, and it's the invention of the West. And please keep that in mind.
But
there is no way to show any relationship, none whatsoever, between knowledge and being Jewish. Being Jewish belongs to an old pragmatic tradition that Americans at least should be able to understand. It's about doing. And that's the one thing that liberal Jews are never ready to articulate. What the hell they think being Jewish is in doing, not in filling or in identity, which is a stupid construct of psychology being paid by idiots in the last 50, 60 years, unable to show anything relevant to science nor to Jewish education.
Oh, I'm so sorry that Bethany isn't here to defend herself, but
there is no way she could.
I feel like what I wanted to say passed us by about 5 minutes ago.
I want to respond to, though, what you were talking about in terms of the new, kind of diffuse knowledge acquisition and everything. It wouldn't be an education event if someone didn't quote Dewey, right? So
hey.
I think of,
a pragmatist.
Go for it.
Exactly.
Go for it.
But I think of it, he talked about method or curriculum as the effective direction of subject matter to desired results. And I think that that when you start talking about, there's an initiative, I haven't heard, there are several initiatives, but for kind of this collective group of students that will then go online for their schooling that used to do it maybe separately, and then they're going to get together to do that as a particular model. That doesn't necessarily guarantee effective direction. It doesn't necessarily guarantee good subject matter, and we're not sure what the desired results are. And so those things can happen, sure, on their own. But I'm not sure that that's addressing what I think that we're trying to address more specifically, which is a more systematic way of going about it. So the question might be, what would the more systematic way of going about it do in order to address the fact that that's the quote-unquote competition? But I'm not sure it's really competition if it's student, like everything I know I learned in Wikipedia,
I appreciate Zvi's emphasis on doing, actually. You should hear him when he gets hyperbolic. But I think that the issue for liberal Jews about doing is not necessarily I won't pay for a service or I won't pay for content. I know especially Generation X has been criticized, and the millennials even more so for not. But I think the doing thing comes back to something, if I could just play with a phrase that we hear at camp a lot, public displays of affection, right? That's the dangerous thing at camp. We don't want PDA, PDA alert, PDA. Woo, woo, woo. Well, I think some years ago I wrote about this. I think we have a PDJ problem among liberal Jews, public displays of Jewishness or Jewish identity formation. I don't like Jewishness because it implies that identity is a noun rather than a verb. And I think, not grammatically speaking, but sociologically speaking, it's an activity, and it's something that's practiced. So I think we need to help liberal Jews, including ourselves, be more comfortable with PDJs. And that comes back to figuring out how to navigate being a part of and apart from. And I know Zvi thinks a lot about this, about what does it mean to stand out and say, hey, right now I'm out in the public sphere as a Jew wearing the hat Jewish and being Jewish, and what I to mix metaphors, baptize my students at Hebrew Union College when they complete my course in sociology. I say, you are now all officially budding Jewish identity formation navigators. That's what it should be on their job description, on their cards. We should all, Jewish educators don't make Jews. I think that's actually an offensive notion. It assumes that we're all sort of morphable products. What Jewish educators can and should do is help Jews navigate what it means to become Jewish and be on a journey. There's an overused, hackneyed word, but that this is a fluid process that, yeah, no, but I think she might agree, that there is something about helping liberal Jews be comfortable with the language, the trappings, the practices of being Jewish in public that we don't primarily have, especially in America. Canada, less so.
So let me take this back then, because I think this gets back to where we started in terms of, the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. Because I think if you look at some of the things that we started to talk about that represent what I'll call the sort of innovation sector in Jewish education, we actually see a lot of, kids who go down to New Orleans to help with post-Katrina work in a Hillel alternative spring break. People who go out to work on community-supported agriculture in JCCs and synagogues. So why is it that Jewish education seems to be held hostage to bar and bat mitzvah and can't seem to get out of this trap that it prepares people for a day but isn't preparing them for a life, if you will? Maybe that's the problem.
Well, synagogues are held hostage. I don't think Jewish education is held hostage. Synagogues are held hostage.
Do you know how many hours are invested in decoding Hebrew that kids will use for, a few hours and then promptly forget?
Well, parents have an investment in that as well. They don't want their kids to make fools of themselves and fools of the parents.
It's the one thing we do succeed at, right? That kids don't embarrass themselves with their parents, right?
Look, I mean, this is not new. There's an unholy alliance that emphasizes bar and bat mitzvah. It's a way of getting members for synagogues and keeping them for a number of years. It's also a way for Jewish educators to have a guaranteed captive audience for a few years. And they've been complicit in that. And I think that's going to change. I think it needs to change.
Yeah, it's a preview for the Jewish Futures Conference, right? Which is about reimagining the bar and bat mitzvah. Right. If we get rid of the bar and bat mitzvah structure, right, then we have, then what?
Or the reform movement's B'nai Mitzvah revolution.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's actually a really powerful and exciting notion. I mean, I'm not talking about the bar and bat mitzvah thing yet. But the notion of getting rid of that as the end result or as the ultimate goal of the whole project in the short term, and instead replacing it with something much more doing or politically, socially, economically justice-oriented or whatever, is much more enticing to a contemporary generation, which I think is potentially under-tapped in that direction.
Svi, would that get at some of the things that concern you about the distributions of power and how that plays out in Jewish education?
Maybe. There are three things that come to mind. There are plenty of things, but there is no time to speak about them if you want to be polite in this situation. So just a couple of things to remind the public. The ultra-Orthodox Jewry, whom we all believe to be stupid and primitive, are growing endlessly. And they have 15 houses in India. And they have 2 houses in Nepal and 5 in Indonesia. Then you have to think about what primitivism means. Liberal Jews went white, so they became lazy. There are good reasons for that, and it's not bad being white. especially because being white affords being powerful. But look at Orthodoxy. They are powerful. They have good ideas of what does it mean to be relevant, and relevant for them means being present in the public sphere, in the agora. I envy them for that. I envy them tremendously for that. The other thing I think it's important to keep in mind is that when you become white, you adopt certain paradigms which are problematic. Among others, you become a racist. That's what we are. But more than that, you believe that schools can help. And when you buy into the tools, into the practices of school, you buy into three basic things. One is you believe that individuality, the separation of the child from the family, is essential. Then you believe that the separation of disciplines is basic to knowledge, and that's why you can think that Judaism can be separated into Talmud and Torah and some other stupid stuff. And then you believe that cognitivism, filling in the minds of children, can help when going into the market. The basic example is that you learn difficult mathematics in the school, and then you don't know how to get the return of your money in the supermarket. Now, when you're dealing with this and not even thinking about it, because you are basically lying to yourself, not because you're an idiot. None of the foundations that support liberal Jewish education are idiots. They all were created by people that were tremendously successful. My enemies are tremendously successful. I respect them for that. Okay, but when you have this paradigm in mind about Catholicism, which is basically what it is, okay, the abstraction of the circumcision from the cutting the penis to the idea of cutting the heart, okay, then you're in trouble. Then you really have stopped being Jewish, okay, because then you don't understand a thing about what being relevant to the world as a Jewish civilization that has what to challenge other civilizations, not because it's right, but because it has its say, and it has what to challenge, okay? When you forget all that, then you're in trouble, that's all.
Well, here's the irony. The irony is that we adopted this Western model because it was a way for us as a community that was an immigrant community to make what we had to offer seem relevant and seem worthwhile to a population that was eager to Americanize. So what do? We take our Jewish education and we Americanize it. We make it look like the public school education that the children are flocking to because they see the public school as their road to success. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, that model doesn't particularly work well, given what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So that's one problem. And B, perhaps we've outgrown it. It's an arbitrary model. That's another issue. And I think we've outgrown the model to a large extent. We're not assimilating. I mean, we are assimilating, but we've won that war, for better or for worse, right? We've been very successful in that regard.
We're here,
we all
and
agree
Look
on
Magazine
that, right?
isn't.
Right. So
I want to apply the arbitrary idea back to bar bat mitzvahs. Bar bat mitzvahs, as we know them today, are a result of a deal that was struck between Jewish educational leaders and the Jews that saw that ceremony as, or a deal that was struck in exchange for synagogue membership and attendance. And never, until maybe last month when the B'nai Mitzvah Revolution Project was launched, has bar and bat mitzvah education ever been systematically interrogated for its educational rationale. Up until now, we've only had the economic exigencies to explain it and what it is. It's been a folk elite invention that kind of fell out But it's been tremendously arbitrary. I don't know that any synagogue, except for the 10 that are working with B'nai Mitzvah Revolution, or 13, that are now asking, what's a bar mitzvah for, really?
So maybe this isn't as hard as as we're making it sound. And one of the jobs of academics, including myself, is to complexify the simple, using the excuse that the world is, after all, complex. So maybe this is really pretty simple. Maybe this is about putting behind us, the forms and structures of 20th century Jewish education and taking up what we know, quote, works. The things that you cited at the beginning and that others have cited in the course of the day, the kinds of activities, the kind of doing Jewish with community and spirit and a measure of thinking and reflection and using texts in ways that illuminate real issues in life, etc. And it ain't so hard to do. I mean, is that where
this
we're going?
This is a place where I'll agree with Zvi about the problematics of the research field in Jewish education, which has improved tremendously, even in the last decade. But
Since we all
think,
got here.
Yeah, well, exactly. No, but I think that one of the problematics there is that we don't have very good measures of what it means to succeed, or any measures of what it means to succeed in Jewish education. We have statistics like, if you go to Jewish school for 6 years, you're going to intermarry. But if you go for 7, you're Jewish for life. Stuff like this, which doesn't tell us anything about what happened in that school situation, or camp. It's all about camp. But we don't know what that means. We have lots of great examples, anecdotal examples of small-scale programs that might work for a certain group of people at a certain place and certain time. But we need much more systematic research about what might work in a very qualitative way, not a quantitative way, so that we can get a much better sense of the potentialities there, I think.
I want to take issue with the last question asked by our beloved moderator.
I was assigned the role of being provocative.
It's all Elena Gindes' fault anyway.
Yeah.
The questions phrased about Jews and for Judaism are basically irrelevant. Always. The issues have nothing to do with what Jews have to tell themselves. It's irrelevant. Inasmuch as Jews in education or research prefer to stay isolated in research because that makes research easy, and in education because it makes it irrelevant, that's really useless. Jews can be relevant to the world in as much as if they participate in the world. And that's what our children want, to be relevant to the world. To be relevant to the world means believing that Judaism has something to challenge to other civilizations. And inasmuch as we don't do that, there is no way we will change it, at least in the liberal world. And we should keep that in mind if we want to deal with serious education. Now, clearly our children will be in favor of us and their parents will not. And that's another big problem, okay? The parents are not stupid. The parents, as I am a parent, want their children to succeed in the world. And if you want to be an emancipator educator, a real critical educator, and you want Judaism to participate in the world, then you're twice in trouble. Not so much because of the children, but because of the context that surrounds us. And that context prefers to keep, in the best tradition of emancipation, Judaism in the house and not in the world. And when Judaism is in the house, Judaism is in trouble. That's all.
I don't think it's such a zero-sum game. I think young, every age Jew today has some experiential value on being Jewish as relevant. It might be irrelevant in an academic or even arbitrary from a sociological and anthropological. It's a category. It's a placeholder to fill in a vessel. It's a color on a canvas, but it's not so arbitrary. I'll give you an example. Every year, I stumbled upon this exercise, and I'll do it with all of you now. Who here, raise your hands, feels that they were the same Jew today as they were 5 years ago?
I don't see too many hands.
Okay, there's no hands. How about 3 years ago? I see one hand, a couple hands. Who here today feels they're the same Jew they were 1 year ago? I see more hands, but still the bulk have not raised their hands. Who here feels that they were the same Jew they were 6 months ago? A few more hands, but my guess is there's still 30% of this room that have not raised their hands, which means that since September, you feel that your Jewish identity formation has been in process, has been emergent. Things are changing. You're experiencing that within you. And that is the messiness, the fluidity, the activity that is identity formation that I think researchers need to figure out how to measure, describe, report, and I do think that qualitative tools are going to help us with that.
So let me throw it open now, I think, to the group. We've talked a while up here, a good long while up here. Just one caveat, please. As tempting as it is, please try to formulate questions, even though Svi doesn't like my questions. Please try to formulate questions and not make speeches. You can get a little premise into your question, but please do it as a question. We have somebody with a mic, I think. I can't see who's out there, so you're going to have to try to figure out who has a question.
Hi, I'm a librarian. I work in a Jewish institution. And I think that I came to here because I wanted to really hear what kind of materials would best support where you feel you'd like to be going. And I have some very clear observations in my head about what I've seen as far as informal education and lifelong learning here in New York City. And I've also witnessed it on the internet. So I'm wondering, did I misinterpret your question of the panel? School meaning the actual physical brick and mortar, as we would call it, school, or did you mean the educational institution? Because I think when we come across, when we approach the issue from a worldly one where people can explore on their own and do so in smaller groups, they will continue all through their lives if they have access to good educators, who may vary in their abilities. But I think that what we need to do is decide where we would like to be, what things seem to be working now. We're talking about evaluation and assessment, not just with children, but with adults. And then make sure that the people who need to know will see that those things happen, because there are a lot of materials are not terribly expensive, but it's doing more with less, perhaps, if we know where we're going.
Mm-hmm. Anyone want to comment on that?
I hope that someday in the world, in the Western world, we'll realize that schools need not be the tools through which we rate society, and that we really make them become places where people can learn freely. By the way, I suggest you buy for your library 2 books. Jacques Rancière, The Ignorant Schoolmaster, and Jacques Rancière, The Philosopher and His Poor. they're both totally non-Jewish. That's why they're good.
Another question? Oh, did you want to comment?
Quickly, yeah. I think you ended your comment by saying do more with less, but I think also less is more. I think I'll give you a librarian example. A pivotal moment for my own research came when I visited a day school in the Bay Area, California Bay Area, and it was just before Halloween, right? A time when all liberal Jews are trying to figure out how to be a part of and apart from simultaneously. Great, acute challenge. And I walked in and I saw something I'd never seen before in any day school, liberal or otherwise. There were Halloween books up in the library, in addition to books about maziks and goblins in Talmudic tradition and text. And I said, revealing my own bias, I said, who allows you to do this? And she said, what do you mean allows me? I don't even know the administration knows I'm doing this. Halloween is such a taboo and a non-item in liberal Jewish day schools. We don't talk about it. And the irony is every single kid is trick-or-treating. Every single teacher, almost every single teacher, is taking their own kids trick-or-treating. And even though day school heads will tell you this is a safe haven, this is an island of safety, because we need to have an incubator for Jewish life to happen, it's not representative, it's not reflective, it's not giving kids and adults tools for figuring out how to navigate being in both worlds. It's creating an artificial situation. So what librarians could do is really embrace and figure out how to help kids navigate. That would be my answer.
Yeah. Next question?
Yeah, thank you. I'm a rabbi being held hostage by the B'nai Mitzvah factory, so I want to challenge the conversation about that a little bit by sort of, I'll ask it like this, that if the B'nai Mitzvah were such a great vehicle for synagogue membership, then why is synagogue affiliation in free fall? Or to put it another way, isn't the revolution happening precisely to coincide with the free fall in synagogue affiliation, which is to say, perhaps someone has recognized wisely that it's not enough anymore, and that's why the revolution is happening, not because we're being very creative about Jewish education. And I'll just throw this other question out. Why do you think camp is so awesome? It's on a different subject.
So I think that part of the problem from the point of view of the synagogues is democratization. It used to be that if you wanted to have a bar mitzvah, unless you were one of those far-out people who maybe would go to the Kotel or Masada to have your bar mitzvah, that the synagogue was the obvious place to go. Now you can Google bar mitzvah, and there are 100 different purveyors. There's the adventure rabbi, and you can go out and do your bar mitzvah with the adventure rabbi, or you could, there are just so many possibilities out there, and I think that there's a lot more competition, and now the synagogues can't rest on their laurels anymore, which might be a good thing. From an American perspective, it is, right? We love competition.
Of course, you could always think about why isn't bar mitzvah at all important? Or since when, for whom, has it become important? In what ways has it become important? And I think those are the serious questions. I have plenty of ultra-Orthodox friends for whom bar mitzvah is not tremendously important. Nor assimilation is important, nor identity is important, nor Holocaust is important. And then I have plenty of liberal Jews for whom only that is important. Maybe the problem is the marking of Judaism as something separate from real life. When you mark something as separate from real life, you can only promise having it separate from real life. And that's not exactly what I think we want.
Anybody want to comment on camp?
There's no such thing as platform 9 3/4. What I mean by that is everybody talks about camp as magic. And there's no shortcut into making Jewish life, Jewish identity meaningful. camp feels, and many ways, by many measures, effective because it's an immersion model. That's my assessment. It's a whole person integrated, confluent model that provides what Peter Berger called a plausibility structure for being Jewish. All of a sudden you see adults in your world behaving Jewishly, doing Jewish, and there's a picture of what it means to become an adult in that world. And sadly, I think we lack that a lot of the time in our liberal Jewish communities outside of camp, which are not immersion models. We have these compartmentalized places and ways of being Jewish.
I mean, and I don't know. I'm not sure about the premise that camp is so. I mean, look, I was an old Camp Ramah person and all that, and loved the experience there and everything. But again, I come back to what are we measuring, you know, as the outcome. I remember saying to a parent of a camper at one point who said to me, you know, Abigail is, you know, missing her swimming lesson right now, and then she's missing this and missing that. It was like a division head at the time. And I said, well, at least she knew where she was supposed to be, right? Because most of the campers, like, they're not there for the Ivrit, you know, or whatever. They're there to spend time in an immersive social experience with their cohort. So I'm a little suspect that, again, that the outcome that's being measured with camp is, I mean, let's acknowledge camp should be, and for most kids, though not all that are there, should be fun. That's a great outcome, you know. But I'm assuming that there's another outcome related to, like, you know, intermarriage or whatever that's really being measured by the success of that system. And I don't know. I mean, I was with my students a couple of weeks ago talking about bang for your buck and for your. I get asked this question all the time. You know, I've got, you know, X amount of money to spend. Is it on early childhood education? Is it on synagogue school? Is it on day school, elementary, high school, camp? What is it? If you measure that out, I think camp is, at least for time in the Jewish education atmosphere, wake time, not just because you sleep there, it's one of the more expensive versions of what you can do, and I don't know what the outcome is.
Well, I mean, it creates ideally positive feelings, and in that respect, I think it's, anecdotally anyway, it's very successful.
Yeah,
there are a lot of people who you speak with who have this loyalty to their camp, and even years after they've stopped going to camp, will look back on their camp experience nostalgically. But there's something there.
No, that's all great, but I don't know that as a Jewish education measure, we're measuring loyalty to camp and to friends. What is that? Well,
but it also translates into feelings about Judaism. I mean, it's one of the interesting things
I don't know
that I write about.
That research. That's what I
let me just say,
say,
one of the things that I'm interested in is this, you know, the problem that that kids had in the 50s and 60s, and probably maybe even today, that they have with reintegration, right? After being in camp for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 8 weeks, coming back to their home congregations and their home environments, and feeling that they are terribly lacking in some kind of way, and feeling turned off by that. You know, I think that one shouldn't be so quick to dismiss that. I think that that's significant. I think it's an indictment of the poverty of Jewish life in these communities, first and foremost. And I think that it's very telling that people feel the need to take kids out of the regular environment and put them in this artificial immersive environment for 2 or 4 weeks to give them something quote unquote real, which is of course the furthest thing from real. But you know, so it is an indictment. But didn't Tzvi say at the beginning of our discussion that you get the Jewish education you deserve?
Yes, I believe that Susan Shevitz was quoted as saying that the Jewish education we get is the Jewish education we want.
It's not we, it's liberal Jews, my friends. Please do not forget there are plenty of Jewish groups doing outstanding jobs politically, economically, legally, and halachically, Jewishly. They're not us. It's only us. And we are not all the Jews, and we're not all of Jewish education. And that's important to remember. There are plenty of groups doing outstanding work and successful work, so successful that they embarrass our presence.
I don't think you should
refuse to learn from them.
I don't think you should romanticize.
I don't romanticize. My dear friends, I never romanticize what ultimately gets expressed in politics. That's not romanticism. That's just looking at reality. Take a look, for example, at what the new fad of foundations is supporting, Taglit, right? The Israel experience. It's the funniest thing that could ever happen. It's insulting to any delicate Jewish mind, liberal especially, okay? It's the renunciation of trying to encounter Israel in its reality. It's just insulting. It's insulting to Jewish ethics. It's insulting to Jewish morality. But it gets supported by the millions. My God, it's only us doing it. Orthodoxy is not doing that. And they are growing. And their political influence is growing. And I might not be happy about it.
I think that's a topic for another evening.
No, it's the same evening. That's the whole point. Education is politics. I'll shut up.
I think we heard you. I think we heard you. I want to give more chance to the folks in the audience.
Just, I guess, following up on that issue right there, which, meaning the title of tonight is Jewish Education Broken, Debating the Future of Jewish Education. And the assumption has been that this is about liberal Jewish education. And Zvi seems to think that orthodoxy or Orthodox Jewish education is doing great. And yet, I think a lot of these same questions and the same problems exist in the Orthodox Jewish day schools and the Orthodox camps. And I wonder why that is kind of being, meaning, yes, Zvi has this beautiful vision of the ultra-Orthodox or in Chabad in Nepal and whatever's going on over there, but I think if we look closer to home, the same issues are being talked about in the day schools where I'm working and the people who I'm around. And so I wonder why that's kind of being left out of the conversation and why you seem to be idealizing it.
Yeah, just to clarify, I deliberately at the beginning did not equate liberal with non-Orthodox because I happen to agree with you. I think there's a lot of dynamism in the Orthodox educational world, including in the Haredi world. There are huge divisions within Haredi Jewish education today. Again, I think it's a worthy topic, and I don't mean in any way, Tzvi, to denigrate what you're saying. I just wanted to make sure that we allow the folks who are up there to get involved in the discussion. But if everybody would like to comment on what you see from your perspective as the ways in which liberal education and what we think of as Orthodox education are or are not sharing in certain issues, in certain challenges, in certain responses, I'd certainly welcome that as a area to comment on.
One way, and I think it's a very important question and one that's important to me in a variety of settings, but I think that one of the ways that I've thought about a contrast between thinking about a system that might be broken or feeling stressed or feeling like there's new directions for a new century and a system that maybe people think is just cruising right along or complacent about, is that the premise of Orthodox education is one, and we've talked about this through the evening, where there, for the most part, and I don't want to overgeneralize anything, there are home and community supports for a vision of what the outcome of that system would be, and the purpose of the education is to reinforce, supplement, build on, and all of that. Whereas in the non-Orthodox world, it's dropping your kid off it and saying, make my kid Jewish, because I'm not going to do it, and I'm assuming that that's why I'm paying you to do it. It's a whole different premise. And I think that system, the second one, which we've, I think, primarily been addressing this evening, is one that feels like it's always playing catch up or thinks that it needs to have an outcome of meaning making or identity formation or whatever else it might be, and needs to be much more adaptable to what changing circumstances might be.
More questions? Yeah, I see a hand at least.
Hi, I'm the aforementioned Daniel Petter-Lipstein, for whatever that was worth. I think why...
Just wanted to show that I got your email.
I appreciate that. I think that what Svi's talking about, and you think about camp, is very relevant in the sense that we want to give children, young adults, etc., safe experiences. Experiences where we are across the board, whether it's Taglit, even Orthodox education, where we are giving kids the answers, where answers matter more than, we're answering the questions we ask matter more than giving kids the tools and the abilities to question answers.
I agree.
And that, I think is a very big issue for a Jewish community, for example, that doesn't talk about that it is now largely part of the 1%. So the question becomes, do we have any hope of creating systems where questioning answers matters more than answering questions, and we're okay with where that leaves in that messiness? Probably not if you're cynical because you think that dominant power structures stay in power. But I think that's the issue that Svi is getting to. And I'll finish with this. It's not easy, John, because you're talking about upending fundamental structures of power, Jewishly, non-Jewishly, etc. If you want to respond to that.
Look, Goffman and Garfinkel were first and foremost good yeshiva buchers. Okay, many people, not all, but many that study Talmud seriously cannot but be critical. Okay, it has nothing to do ultimately with if you're Orthodox or unorthodox. I agree with your agreement. I'm afraid that the geniuses that direct, created, and implement Jewish liberal education, because they're geniuses, they understand it's not worthwhile doing what I think we both want them to do. Look, this question has nothing to do with Jews, as most of the questions that we're discussing here have nothing to do with Jews specifically. They have to do with majorities and minorities. And they have to do with what is it that we want out of this complex world. One of the big questions is, do we want the poor to be emancipated or to be able to eat? Okay, and depending what answer you give, it's what you get. And it's the same with Jews. Do we want Jews to be able to co-share the power of the world, or do we want them to be Jewish? And that's the liberal question, and they have an answer. They want Harvard. I want Jews, and I cannot promise I can succeed. I haven't succeeded ever. I want Jews to engage with other minorities that suffer in a Western world that recognizes no other than themselves, okay, to enrich it. That's all what I want. But the Western world doesn't want that, okay? They're happy killing me or any other. It doesn't matter who the other is. The next other in Europe will be the Muslims. It's the same. Okay? I as a Jew believe we should be engaged, okay, in the struggle of creating equality and creating recognition for minorities. believe me, most of the parents that send their children to Jewish liberal schools just do not want that. And they might be right. I'm the last one to judge them. I judge them personally, I mean, but that's it.
So we're reaching the end of the time, so let me just invite Jonathan and Tali and Ben to add any final comments that you'd like to make, whether it relates directly to this dialogue or not.
I'll pick up on this a little bit and say I agree with Zvi about the politics of difference in the United States especially, but I have a different wish. Zvi shared his wish. My wish is that one of the framings of this evening was, what's the future of Jewish education? I actually think one of the things that that would be really helpful is if we actually relinquished any sense that we have control over the future and stop squandering the present educational moments that we have with students, people in our classroom moments. So surrendering outcomes, which is totally difficult and anxiety-provoking because, hey, what are we doing? I need to know impact studies, how many Jews are marrying Jews, how many, all those kinds of indicators. They can be important, but I think for the Jewish teacher in the classroom, for the Jewish counselor at camp, for the Jewish youth group leader at Bowling Alley X, it's about the moment that you have with them here and now. As a child or an adult is emerging, we all know that at least 5 years ago, none of us was the same Jew we were in this whole room. And so if we can sort of address our neuroses a little bit and begin to surrender the fantasy that we actually have control over the future and get in touch with our survivalist angst enough to actually take advantage of and really embrace the moments in the present that we have with each other and say, you know what? All these kids, all these adults that we're teaching, they're going to make their own choices anyway. So we might as well invest in this present moment and give them the best that Jewish education has to offer.
I want to just pick up on that. It's a lovely vision, and I much appreciate it. It's just I can't disaggregate this notion of not controlling the future with what's going on right now, because it's a well-proven by research axiom that teachers teach the way that they were taught, and so we have to be very planful, not about just the teachable moment that comes along or the wonder of what's going on right here and now, but to think that our students are the future Jewish educators, if there is a future to Jewish education. So it's a little bit more than just what we think about in terms of this one thing working. I think it's a much longer range. I don't know. Am
I allowed to qualify one sentence?
Yep.
I definitely imply a systemic response to that, and not it's not about one professional learning workshop.
Yeah, okay.
This is
that wasn't clear.
Yeah.
All right.
So and I'm going to historians always get the last word, right? They tell us what happened, so it's fitting
the first word.
That we end with Jonathan.
So I would just say, taking it in a slightly different direction, but maybe full circle. You said at the beginning of our discussion that the revolution is here, but it's not evenly distributed. And I agree with that. But I also believe that, to go back to Samson Benderly, who in many ways is the founder of Jewish education in the United States, or certainly a popularizer of Jewish education in the United States, perhaps. We exist, Jewish education in America exists in a free market. And our role is to create options for people, and then people have to decide for themselves. I think the innovation that's been going on, we discussed a little bit over the last this last hour or so, I think the innovation is wonderful, and I think we should continue to innovate. We should continue to have options for people, American Jewish World Service, I mean, you name it. We should have service learning, all kinds of day school, all kinds of options. And then the people have to decide what they want. And not everyone's going to decide the same way. And that's the beauty of America, or our downfall, one or the other.
So thank you. I lied. I actually get the last word. But it's a word, first of all, to say thank you to our 4 panelists. Really fabulous job. Thank you to Helena Gindi and the Posen Foundation and the other co-sponsors for making this possible. If you are interested in continuing some of these conversations, you may do so among yourselves, of course, but you may also, as was kindly plugged up here, you can do so at the next upcoming Jewish Futures X conference, which will take place on February 27th on the future of bar bat mitzvah. You can do so on January 29th at a convening on innovative models of complementary, supplementary, part-time, whatever you want to call it, Jewish education. Just convenings@jesna.org is the email address to write to get further information and an invitation and registration for that. Those of you who are interested can do so on the Jewish Education Change Network, jedchange.net. And I'm sure you know many, many other places where you can continue this conversation. So I hope that this evening whetted your appetite. Thank you all for being here, and have a safe trip home. Chag Hanukkah Sameach, and a good new year.